Moses' secret past exposed. The river was quiet that morning, its surface cloaked in mist as if hiding something ancient and holy beneath. Along its edge, reeds rustled with the soft hum of frogs and distant bird calls. Among them, a woman knelt, her face drawn tight with fear and desperation. Her name was Jochebed. She held her infant son close, wrapping him in cloth with trembling fingers. His tiny eyes blinked slowly, unaware of the danger that wrapped around them like the Egyptian heat. Pharaoh's new law had condemned every Hebrew male child to death. No son was safe, not even hers. A gentle sob escaped her lips. "My little one," she whispered, "Yahweh preserve you." Then, with a final prayer, she placed him in the basket woven from papyrus and sealed with pitch. She kissed his brow, her tears falling onto his cheeks. Her daughter, Miriam, stood nearby, silent, clutching her shawl. Jochebed pushed the basket into the current, watching as it drifted away, swallowed by reeds and morning fog. She didn't know if she would ever see her son again. But Yahweh knew. Pharaoh's daughter, Bithiah, had long grown tired of the noise within the palace walls. The endless shuffle of sandals, the scent of oiled bodies and incense, the cloying perfume of politics, it all suffocated her. So she came to the Nile, as she often did, to bathe and breathe. Her maids waited respectfully, heads bowed, eyes averted. The water lapped gently around her ankles as she waded in. That's when she saw the basket. "A child?" she whispered as one of her servants pulled it ashore. She reached down herself and parted the covering. He was beautiful, his skin dark and smooth like polished olive wood. His cries pierced her, filling the air with a sacred sort of sorrow. Her breath caught. Something stirred in her that she had never felt before. "This is one of the Hebrews' children," one of her attendants said quietly. Bithiah knew it was true. The cloth, the basket, it was unmistakable. And yet, she made her decision. "He is mine now," she said. "Bring him to the palace. I will raise him as a prince of Egypt." They called him Moses. He grew amid gold and grandeur, educated by the finest minds in the land. While Hebrew children were taught to bake bricks beneath the scourge of the whip, Moses studied the stars, geometry, and the sacred texts of Thoth. He learned to ride horses, to wield the sickle sword, to speak in measured tones, and command respect with a glance. Yet the palace was never truly home. There were things he could not forget. The occasional whispers of the servants, the strange language spoken by the slaves when they thought no one was listening. A girl in the market once looked at him with recognition in her eyes. Fear and hope tangled in her gaze. He had asked his mother once, Bithiah, why he looked different from his brothers and cousins. She'd smiled, evading the question with tales of divine favor. But he knew there was more. Moses was 30 when he began to walk alone among the Hebrew quarters. Dressed as a noble, he moved unnoticed through the narrow alleys where the scent of sweat and despair clung to every wall. He watched as overseers barked orders, as men collapsed beneath loads of mud and straw. He listened to their songs, laments to a God he did not yet know. One day he saw a man, an Egyptian, beating a Hebrew slave mercilessly. Blood soaked the man's robe. The Hebrew cried out, curling into himself, arms raised in futile defense. Something within Moses snapped. Without thinking, without planning, he struck the Egyptian. Once, twice, a final time. Silence fell. The man was dead. The Hebrew lay still, eyes wide in shock. Moses turned, breath heaving, realizing what he had done. He buried the body in the sand that night, and for a moment thought it was over. But news traveled faster than guilt. The next day he saw two Hebrews quarreling. He tried to intervene. "Who made you a ruler and judge over us?" one spat. "Will you kill me as you kill the Egyptian?" The words hit like a whip. He ran. He fled into the desert, heart pounding, the heat rising around him like a curse. Days passed in a blur of thirst, hunger, and regret. He wandered until he collapsed near a well in Midian. That's where he met Zipporah. She was strong-willed, graceful, and unafraid. She and her sisters had come to draw water, but shepherds drove them off. Moses intervened. His anger found purpose, redirected against injustice. Their father Jethro took him in. Years passed. Moses married Zipporah, had a son, and learned the quiet life of a shepherd. But his dreams betrayed him. The palace, the cries of slaves, the blood in the sand. Then one day a bush burned, but was not consumed. Moses, the voice stopped his breath. He fell to his knees. "Remove your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." He trembled. "I am the God of your fathers," the voice continued, "the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I have seen the suffering of my people in Egypt. I will deliver them, and you will go to Pharaoh." Moses shook his head. "Who am I that I should go?" The voice thundered, but not with anger, with power. "I will be with you." He returned to Egypt with his brother Aaron, who greeted him with tears and disbelief. Together they confronted Pharaoh. "Let my people go." Pharaoh laughed. Then came the plagues: blood, frogs, locusts, darkness. One by one, the gods of Egypt were humbled. Each time Pharaoh hardened his heart, until the last. Death came for the firstborn, and then deliverance. The Hebrews fled into the night with haste and trembling, guided by fire and cloud. At the Red Sea, Moses raised his staff and the waters parted. Pharaoh's chariots chased, but the waters returned. Free below him, the promised land stretched into the horizon, a land he would never enter. He had seen wonders, spoken with God face to face, led a people through wilderness, rebellion, and miracles. But still, one secret had never been revealed. Until now. After Moses' passing, the people mourned for 30 days, but their grief was weighted with reverence. They had not merely lost a prophet or a leader. They had lost the only man who had spoken with God as one speaks with a friend. The camp was quiet in those days, the fire small, and every face bore the burden of finality. And yet, within the morning, a subtle tremor of expectation stirred. Joshua had taken the mantle, and with him a new chapter had begun. But some had not forgotten the mysteries that followed Moses like a shadow. Eleazar, son of Aaron's line, was one such man. He had been but a boy when Moses had come down from Sinai, his face radiant with glory. He had watched the people recoil in fear while Moses veiled himself. He remembered whispers among the elders, cryptic prayers, and the way even Aaron, his own father, had spoken of Moses with equal parts awe and trepidation. But there was one moment, long buried in Eleazar's memory, that refused to fade. It had been during their wandering through the wilderness in the region of Horeb, when the people had grown restless again, shouting for meat, for comfort, for gods they could see. Eleazar had wandered to the edge of the camp late one night, unable to sleep. There he had seen Moses, alone and barefoot, walking into the darkness beyond the tents. Eleazar had followed, curious, careful to stay hidden in the shadows. Moses had stopped at a high rock and knelt. He had spoken aloud, not in Hebrew, but in a language Eleazar did not understand, a tongue ancient and powerful, like the wind itself. The air had grown still, unnaturally so, and then Moses had wept. Eleazar had not told anyone, not even his father, but the image stayed with him, a man crushed under knowledge too deep for mortal understanding. Now, years later, that memory returned with new force. He had read the scrolls Moses left behind, the known ones, the public writings, the Torah, the law, the history. But he also knew that Moses had kept some writings hidden, stored away in a sacred ark that only Joshua and the elders had been allowed to see. What truths did Moses guard so tightly? What part of his past had remained concealed even from his people? Joshua himself had sensed it. In the weeks following Moses' death, he found himself pacing the edge of Mount Nebo, where the prophet had breathed his last. The mountain had a strange presence, quiet but alert, as if listening. Joshua often felt watched there, though no man or beast stirred. On one such evening, a storm rolled across the sky without rain. Thunder cracked, and a strange light shimmered across the summit. Joshua ascended, drawn not by fear, but by something deeper, unfinished. At the peak, where Moses had once stood, the wind was deafening. But as Joshua knelt, it ceased, leaving behind a silence so profound it rang in his ears. Then a voice spoke, not aloud, not with words, but inside him. He carried what none could, but you must carry what remains. Joshua gasped. He turned but saw no one. Then he noticed something lodged between the stones at his feet. A small leather-wrapped scroll, hidden beneath a slab cracked by age. He reached for it, hands trembling. It bore no title, no markings. He unwrapped it carefully and read. The scroll was not history, it was confession. Written in Moses' own hand, it began not with grandeur, but with pain. To whoever comes after me, know this, I was born twice, once in the shadow of oppression, and again in the house of Pharaoh. Both were miracles, both were prisons. Moses had written of dreams he'd had as a child, where fire whispered and rivers bled. He had written of his confusion at being both prince and stranger, loved yet always apart. He spoke of Pahor, the high priest, and the secret prophecy buried beneath Ra's temple. How the prophecy had been older than Abraham, passed down through obscure tribes, exiled by the early kings of Egypt. The signs were carved into walls long before Joseph walked this land. They foretold a child not of royal blood, but of divine appointment. A child born under foreign stars, wrapped in dust, raised by queens, destined to burn the empire's breath with a single word, Yahweh. Moses had realized only after many years in Midian that he was the fulfillment of that ancient text. But it terrified him. He questioned God often, not out of pride, but because he feared becoming the very thing Pharaoh once was, a ruler without mercy. He wrote of nights spent in the tent, weeping after delivering judgment to rebellious tribes, of days when he doubted if Yahweh truly walked with them, or if he had been abandoned in a sea of wandering souls. He wrote of the serpent staff, how it terrified him more than any army, of the moment God turned his hand leprous and he thought, this power can also destroy. But most of all, he wrote of the moment at the rock, when he had struck it in anger, not trust. I did not doubt God's presence. I doubted his mercy. I feared the people would never change, and I let that fear become wrath. And then he wrote something Joshua had never heard before. The day I killed the Egyptian, I knew him. He was not merely a guard, he was one of Pharaoh's private advisors. He knew who I was, knew of the prophecy. He had come to arrest me quietly, to have me executed in secret before the truth could bloom. I struck him not in rage, but in defense. But even as I buried him, I knew something else. He was my half-brother. Joshua stopped reading, stunned. Moses had been raised as Pharaoh's grandson. But if what he wrote was true, and the man he killed was his brother by blood, then Moses was more Egyptian than he ever admitted, more royal, more torn. The scroll continued. My mother, Bithiah, was not barren. She had a son before me. But Pharaoh grew jealous of the boy's popularity and arranged for him to be sent away under the guise of military command. He returned years later, bitter, loyal only to the throne. When he saw me in the streets speaking with the Hebrews, something in him cracked. He realized I was not like him, that I was not Pharaoh's blood, yet stood closer to power than he ever had. He knew the secret, and he came for me. And I, without understanding the full weight, ended his life. That moment sealed my fate. Joshua finished the scroll in silence. He sat long into the night, the stars above him crisp and close. The truth was staggering. Moses, the liberator, had been shaped as much by secrets as by miracles. His calling had come wrapped in violence and confusion. He had borne a hidden scar that never healed, even as he split seas and called down fire. Yet it was that scar, Joshua realized, that made him real, made him human, and perhaps it was that same brokenness that made him chosen. The discovery of Moses' hidden scroll set Joshua on edge. Even in death, the prophet's voice echoed with unsettling clarity. The revelation of Moses' Egyptian brother, the buried prophecy, and the spiritual burden he carried, none of it matched the clean version of history they recited in worship or remembered in campfire tales. Joshua debated whether to share the scroll with the elders. He feared it might fracture the already fragile unity of Israel. There were those who idolized Moses as a faultless patriarch. To To unveil his vulnerability now might create a rift. Yet burying the truth was equally dangerous. For how could a people move forward without first understanding what had shaped them? As he descended from Mount Nebo, scroll wrapped tight in goatskin, Joshua resolved to pray. If Yahweh had left the scroll for him to find, he would give the answer. But Yahweh was silent. That night, as stars shimmered above the camp of Israel like oil on water, Joshua lay awake. His dreams were troubled. He saw Moses walking among shadowy figures, faces he didn't recognize. The prophet was speaking in a foreign tongue, his hands bleeding as he etched symbols into stone. Then, suddenly, the stone shattered, and Moses disappeared into a fire that consumed the heavens. Joshua awoke sweating, gasping for breath. He reached for the scroll again, rereading the final lines. My story is not meant to be a monument. It is meant to be a warning. Power without surrender is poison, and prophecy without obedience is madness. Let those who lead remember, the fire of God refines, but it also consumes. He folded the parchment with care and made his decision. He would not hide the truth, but he would reveal it slowly, first to Eleazar and Caleb, the two who had stood closest to Moses in his final days. They, he knew, would understand. Days passed. Israel's camp moved steadily toward the banks of the Jordan River. The Ark of the Covenant led the way, borne by Levites in silence. Joshua walked beside it, but the scroll weighed heavier than the tablets inside the Ark. When he finally met with Eleazar and Caleb, it was under the shade of a terebinth tree. The air was dry, their voices hushed. He handed them the scroll without explanation. Eleazar read it first, face darkening with every line. When he finished, he looked at Joshua, not with shock, but with solemn understanding. I always knew there was more, he said. His eyes carried wars we never fought. Caleb, the warrior who had faced giants and crossed deserts, was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "What do we do with it?" Joshua looked past them, to where the Jordan glinted in the sun like a promise not yet claimed. "We remember it," he said, "not for worship, but for wisdom." Meanwhile, across the river in the land of Canaan, rumors had begun to stir. The kings of the region, Amorites, Jebusites, Canaanites, and more, had long heard tales of the Israelites and their mysterious leader. But now, spies returned with strange news. Moses is dead, they reported, but his successor carries a fire in his eyes. Some rejoiced, thinking Israel weaker without their old prophet. Others feared the change, believing a younger leader might be bolder, more dangerous. Among the anxious was King Balak of Moab, who had once summoned Balaam to curse Israel. Now, Balak summoned Balaam again, not for curses, but for answers. The prophet, older and grayer, came reluctantly. "You cannot curse what God has blessed," Balaam said as soon as he entered the throne room. "I don't want curses," Balak snapped. "I want knowledge. Tell me of this man, this Joshua. Is he like Moses?" Balaam closed his eyes. His voice shifted, distant and grave. "He is not Moses, but the fire that walked with Moses now walks beside him, and the scrolls of the mountain have not been fully read." Balak frowned. "Scrolls?" Moses left behind more than law. He left behind thunder. Back in Israel's camp, Eleazar had begun to study the scroll in depth, cross-referencing it with other sacred texts. He found subtle consistencies, phrases Moses had spoken publicly that now made more sense. "I was a stranger in a strange land. Do not forget the alien, for you were aliens in Egypt." These weren't just spiritual metaphors, they were personal. And then he found something chilling, a reference buried in a genealogy that pointed to a woman named Aseneth, once wife of Joseph, mother of Ephraim and Manasseh. In an apocryphal text known only to the oldest scribes, Aseneth had been a priestess in On, daughter of Potipharah, trained in the mysteries of Ra. She had renounced her gods after marrying Joseph, but her lineage remained preserved in secret. Her descendants had intermarried with lower Egyptian nobility, and from that line, through generations of shadowed names, came Bithia. Eleazar brought this to Joshua, breathless. "She was Egyptian royalty," he said, "but through Joseph's bloodline." Joshua stared at the parchment. So, Moses wasn't just adopted into Pharaoh's house, he was born into a hidden covenant. Eliezer nodded, both Hebrew and Egyptian, both priest and prophet. He embodied the tension between two worlds. Joshua's mind raced. If this was true, then Moses had not only been the liberator of Israel, he had been the bridge between Abraham's promise and Egypt's wealth, the spiritual heir of both Joseph and Levi. The implications were staggering. Had God orchestrated even this? Had he placed Moses at the crossroads of history, not just to lead, but to reconcile? News of Joshua's first act, parting the Jordan as Moses had parted the Red Sea, spread rapidly. When the people crossed on dry ground, the older generation wept, remembering that first miracle. But only Joshua, Eliezer, and Caleb knew the deeper miracle, that they walked not just on earth, but on legacy. And that Moses' story, far from ending at Nebo, was now their inheritance. But not all were content to let that story rest. Within the ranks of Israel, particularly among the mixed multitude who had left Egypt with them, a faction had grown skeptical. They murmured about Joshua's authority, about the old secrets of Moses, about why the ark had been hidden away during certain ceremonies. A man named Nadab, a distant cousin of Korah, began to gather followers. He had been a child during Korah's rebellion, but remembered his parents speaking of Moses with contempt. Moses was not the man you believe, Nadab whispered to eager ears. He was raised in temples of idols. He killed his own brother. His law is stained with blood. The murmurs grew. Joshua knew he could crush the rebellion with a word. But he had learned from Moses, harshness invites division, wisdom invites loyalty. Instead, he called a public assembly, and for the first time, he read from the hidden scroll. The people listened in stunned silence as Joshua unveiled Moses' confession. He read every line, his fears, his doubts, his failures, and the truth of his brother's death. And when he finished, he said only this: if God could use a broken man to deliver a nation, then he can use us to possess the land. Moses was not perfect, he was honest, and it was his honesty that God honored. There was no applause, but the murmuring stopped. Nadab left the camp that night. Years passed. Israel conquered cities, inherited vineyards they did not plant, lived in houses they did not build. But the memory of Moses lingered, not just in song or scripture, but in the truth he had finally shared. Children grew up hearing the full story, not the legend, but the life. And they revered him not because he was flawless, but because he had walked through fire and still chosen to lead. Joshua, before his own death, placed Moses' scrolls in a stone chamber beside the ark, not to be worshipped, but to be remembered. And over time, a new phrase entered the language of Israelite prayer. As Moses walked, so may we walk, in weakness, in truth, and in the presence of God. Years passed after Joshua's reading of the scroll, and the land of Canaan began to take on the dust and footprints of Israel. Tribes claimed their portions, Judah in the south, Ephraim in the heartland, Dan struggling to hold its borders. Reuben and Gad settled across the Jordan, but within every new settlement, every altar raised and well dug, the story of Moses still walked among the people like an unseen shepherd. Fathers told their sons of the sea splitting in two, mothers reminded their daughters of the manna that fell like dew, and always, quietly in the hush of night and firelight, someone would speak of the scroll, the one Moses left behind. In the tribe of Benjamin, nestled among the hills near Bethel, a young man named Amariah sat by a fire with his grandfather, who had once served under Caleb. Was Moses truly Pharaoh's son? Amariah asked, eyes wide with youthful curiosity. No, said the old man, but he was Pharaoh's grandson. And did he kill his own brother? The elder sighed, his breath catching in his beard. He did, but not with joy. Moses had the heart of a priest, even when wielding a sword. He bled every time he raised his hand. The boy thought a while, then asked, why would God choose someone so broken? The elder chuckled softly, because he needed someone who could understand the pain of both the palace and the slave yard. Meanwhile, deep within the tent of meeting, now rebuilt in Shiloh where the ark rested, Eliezer had begun copying Moses' scroll onto new parchment. Not for distribution, but for preservation. He understood that paper rotted and ink faded, but the truth must endure. With each stroke of the quill, he felt the weight of Moses' voice pressing into his chest. He wrote the final line again and again as if it were a command. Let the leaders remember, a rod can part the sea or strike the rock, but the heart behind it determines what God sees. One morning, as the sun broke over the tabernacle and painted the canvas walls gold, Eliezer was interrupted by a courier. It was a young priest, panting and pale. "Come quickly," he gasped. "A woman has come from Egypt." Eliezer hurried to the outer courtyard. There, near the altar, stood a woman wrapped in deep blue linen, bearing the scent of myrrh and desert wind. Her eyes were ringed in black coal. She was neither young nor old, but her presence was undeniable, like the hush before thunder. "Who are you?" Eliezer asked. She bowed. "I am Nefertari, daughter of Pehor, last of the temple of Ra. I bring word and warning." The name Pehor rang in Eliezer's mind like a bell struck too hard. "You're his daughter, the high priest who raised Moses?" "His adopted daughter," she said. "He found me abandoned as a babe near the Nile. He raised me alongside the boy you call Moses." She stepped forward, eyes boring into his. "I know the truth of his birth, and I know the prophecy Pharaoh tried to destroy." Eliezer led her inside. As she spoke, the old world came alive. She told of temples filled with starlight and incense, of scrolls locked in ivory boxes, and of a prophecy known only to three: Pharaoh's oracle, the chief scribe of Memphis, and Pehor. The prophecy foretold, "From the reeds shall rise the one whose tongue stammers, but whose voice will shake nations. Born of slaves, raised by queens. Fire shall obey him, and water shall listen, but his shadow shall carry the storm." Nefertari said Pehor had watched over Moses not only as a protector but as a believer. "He knew your God long before your people did," she whispered. "We called him by other names, but his fire was the same." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a worn stone tablet, etched with symbols older than Hebrew. "The final piece," she said. "Moses never saw this." Eliezer studied the stone. Though written in ancient Egyptian, he could decipher parts. With help from Nefertari, a translation formed. "He who is born under the sign of silence will bring judgment with his breath. His past shall be his proving, his exile, his anointing. He shall return not as prince, but as voice." It confirmed everything Moses had written, and more. He had not stumbled into destiny. He had been forged for it. But this new line stirred a different question in Eliezer's mind. What if the story wasn't over? Far to the south, in the edges of Egypt's shifting borders, another story was unfolding. An old man named Seraphon, once scribe to Pharaoh's court, now lived in solitude near the Red Sea. He had witnessed the rise and fall of Ramses II. He had read the stolen fragments of prophecy and heard Moses' name whispered like a curse in shadowed halls. Now, in the twilight of his years, he carved a record of everything he remembered. Names, dates, visions. He called it the Book of the Burning Ones. He wrote not only of Moses, but of others who had seen God's fire. Abraham, Elijah, a nameless servant of Enoch. He believed Moses had been part of a lineage stretching back before Babel, tied by one thread, a divine fire that demanded surrender. But Seraphon feared something more. He wrote, "If the fire that once walked with Moses returns, will it purify us or consume us whole?" In Shiloh, Eliezer placed Nefertari's stone tablet beside the ark. Not inside it, for it was not law, but truth. He summoned the council of elders and read the full record. Moses' scroll, the Egyptian prophecy, Nefertari's testimony. There was debate. Some said it was heresy, others, revelation. But all agreed on one thing: the legacy of Moses was not history. It was a warning to every leader. And so they composed a prayer to be recited by every priest and king upon assuming leadership. As Moses walked in fire and fear, let me walk in truth and trembling. As he bowed, so let me bow. Let the secrets of my soul serve the people, not the throne. Many generations later, the kings of Israel would still whisper his name in their solitude. Solomon, in his wisdom, read the scroll in silence and sealed it in a vault beneath the temple. He wrote in his Proverbs, "Better a broken vessel filled with fire than a golden cup empty of fear." He was speaking of Moses, and though empires rose and fell, and though Babylon would one day burn the temple's gates, the truth of Moses endured. Not because it was grand, but because it was honest. He had been prince and fugitive, prophet and murderer. He had failed God, and yet God had not failed him. He had lived 2 lives and died once, but his legacy lived eternally. It was in the days of the judges, long after Joshua's bones had been laid to rest beneath the shadow of Mount Gosh, that the memory of Moses began to fade. Not his name. That was still sung in battle cries and solemn prayers. But the man behind the myth, the flawed, fiery soul who had stood before both Pharaoh and God, became blurred beneath the weight of legend. Statues replaced stories. Songs replaced confession. In the scroll, it vanished, not lost, hidden. Only a few still knew where it was, a line of silent stewards, chosen by Eleazar's descendants, bound by oath to guard the truth and never speak of it unless God himself stirred the fire again. For generations, the scroll slept. In a small village near Gilgal, in the time of Deborah, a boy named Ithamar lived with his uncle, a former Levite scribe exiled for speaking out against the corruption of a regional judge. Ithamar was curious, relentless, always asking questions the adults grew tired of answering. Why did Moses break the tablets? Why did God bury him where no one could find him? Why did he hit the rock instead of speaking to it? His uncle, weary but wise, finally told him, because Moses was human, and when a man carries the voice of God too long, his own voice starts to tremble. Those words planted themselves deep in Ithamar's soul. One night, while rummaging through his uncle's sealed chest, Ithamar found a leather-bound copy of part of the hidden scroll. Not the full confession, just fragments, phrases, passages. He read by oil lamp until the dawn, his young heart burning with a revelation more terrifying than any battlefield story. Moses had doubted. Moses had feared. Moses had loved Egypt, even as he fled it. When Ithamar grew, he became a scribe himself. Not a priest, not a prophet, but his hands copied truth and his eyes never forgot what they'd read. He secretly added Moses' human words beside the divine law, not to degrade it, but to anchor it in reality. In the margins of the Torah scrolls he copied, he would hide brief notes in small script. Here he wept. Here he remembered his brother. This command cost him sleepless nights. Over time, a handful of other scribes noticed. They began whispering to one another about the shadow script, the buried human story of the lawgiver. And like water beneath stone, it spread, quietly, persistently, through Israel. Centuries passed. The ark was captured by the Philistines. Saul rose, then fell. David danced before the Lord, and Solomon built a temple brighter than the sun. And still, beneath the gold and smoke, the truth of Moses endured. During the reign of Solomon, a young Levite named Uriel was tasked with maintaining the temple archives. He discovered, buried beneath cedar scrolls and gold leaf, a sealed clay jar with an inscription burned into it: "Do not open unless the fire returns." He ignored it, but every night after, he dreamed of a man in a desert, barefoot, shouting at a burning bush that would not burn out. Finally, unable to resist, he opened it. Inside was the original scroll, the full confession of Moses, written in his hand, along with Nefertari's stone tablet and a faded map of ancient Memphis, marked with a red symbol. Uriel fell to his knees. He realized then that Israel had preserved the law, but lost the story. He copied the scroll word for word, then sealed the original again and hid it behind the wall of the temple treasury. He called his copy The Secret of the Flame. Years later, as Babylon approached and Jerusalem trembled beneath the boots of Nebuchadnezzar's armies, a young prophet named Jeremiah would hold that copy in his shaking hands. And as he wept over the coming destruction, he read Moses' words: "A leader is not made strong by certainty, but by surrender." Jeremiah echoed those words in his Lamentations. He understood then, Israel's strength had never come from her kings, her armies, or her altars. It had come from the wilderness, from the voice of a stuttering man who carried fire in his soul and brokenness in his bones. And still, the scroll survived. When Babylon burned the temple and exiled the people, a small remnant of scribes fled with sacred items. Among them was Ezra, who would later rebuild not just walls, but memory. Ezra read the scroll in secret before standing on the wooden platform to read the law aloud to the people. He wept before they did, because he had seen Moses not only as a lawgiver, but as the man who once wept over a murdered brother, who once argued with God in the sand, who once struck a rock not out of rebellion, but from the exhaustion of carrying millions alone. Ezra restored the law, but he never forgot the man behind it. In time, the world changed. Greece marched across the known world. Rome built roads through Jerusalem. Prophets fell silent for 400 years, and still a whisper remained. Scribes in Alexandria, Babylon, and Qumran preserved traces of the shadow script. In the Essene caves, fragments of Moses' confession were found on torn goat parchment, stained with age but burning with truth. One line in particular survived intact. "I feared that if they saw who I really was, they would reject the one who sent me." Then one day in the dusty hills of Galilee, a carpenter's son would climb a mountain and say, "You have heard it said to the people long ago, but I tell you," and those who listened swore they heard the voice of Moses in his rhythm, but gentler, deeper, more rooted. The fire had returned, not in thunder and smoke, but in grace and truth. When he was transfigured, his face shone like the sun, and who stood beside him? Moses and Elijah. Not as spirits, not as shadows, but as men, whole again. And Moses, no longer hiding his story, now stood in the light of the one who had always known it. Long after Golgotha, long after the tomb was empty, early followers of the way copied parts of Moses' scroll into letters and sermons. Some said Peter had read the scroll. Others claimed Paul found a Greek translation among diaspora scrolls in Antioch. But what mattered most was this. They saw Moses not as a hero to be idolized, but as a man to be understood. And in understanding him, they better understood themselves. Today, scholars argue over the authenticity of the shadow script. Some say it was invented later, a literary device. Others believe fragments found in the Dead Sea Scrolls point to a lost section of Deuteronomy once removed from the canon. But the truth lives on, not in text, but in testimony, for every leader who has doubted, every prophet who has stumbled, every teacher who has stood between obedience and fear. There is comfort in knowing Moses was not a statue. He was a man, and in the heart of his confession lies a prayer for all generations. O God of fire and dust, if you can use one like me, then perhaps my brokenness can be a door, not a wall. Let my failures speak louder than my victories, for they testify to your mercy. And if ever my name is remembered, let it not be for my rod or law, but for the day I removed my sandals and dared to listen. Generations pass like wind across stone. Empires rise and their dust settles into forgotten corners of the earth. But some stories, etched not in marble, but in the marrow of humankind, continue to breathe. Moses' story was one of them. But in time, even stories begin to fade. Centuries after the days of the apostles, during the early years of the church's great persecution under Roman rule, a monk named Aurelius traveled from Judea to Alexandria in search of ancient writings. He had heard rumors of a scroll hidden deep in the catacombs beneath a burned-out synagogue, a scroll said to contain the heart of Moses. He found it, or what was left of it, cracked parchment, fire-touched edges, words smeared by time and sweat. But enough survived to make Aurelius tremble. He returned to a desert monastery and spent his life preserving it, not in ink but in voice. Each evening, after prayers, he would sit with younger monks and whisper pieces of the scroll into the silence. The passage he repeated most: "I was not chosen because I was strong. I was strong because I was chosen. But even chosen ones doubt. Even they bleed." His voice cracked when he said it, because he too had bled. The Middle Ages swept through like a tide of steel and stone. Armies marched with crosses and banners. Crusaders fought for Jerusalem, not realizing that the man who once led God's people toward that land had died without ever stepping foot in it. The irony was not lost on those few mystics and scribes who still kept fragments of Moses' secret story hidden in family vaults, monasteries, or wrapped in layers of silk beneath the floorboards of forgotten synagogues. One such mystic, a Jewish philosopher in Cordoba named Ben Aviram, wrote in a private letter, "It is not the Red Sea that defines Moses. It is the moment he fell on his face before God, admitting he was not enough, and yet still obeyed." During the Enlightenment, historians questioned the miracle of the Exodus, the laws of Sinai, the plagues, but even the most skeptical scholars could not deny the strange magnetism of Moses. What kind of leader willingly steps aside from power, lets another finish his task, and disappears into the wilderness to die? Alone? That paradox became the subject of essays, debates, even poems. And within the Vatican, deep in the restricted archives, a Jesuit scholar named Matteo Rinaldi came across a footnote in a 4th century manuscript, De Confessione Moisi, or The Confession of Moses. The original was long gone, but the footnote quoted a line that stunned Matteo. "I broke the tablets not out of anger, but to remind them that no law is greater than the heart it is written on." That night, Matteo wrote in his journal, "The Moses of stone commands awe, but the Moses of flesh, he heals." In the 20th century, after the horrors of World War and genocide, rabbis, priests, and theologians found themselves reaching again for the older truths. Those less concerned with glory and more with survival, with human ache. A discovery in the Qumran caves gave them reason. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls were torn segments of a previously unknown document, now labeled Fragment X52. It described a moment never recorded in Torah. Moses alone in the wilderness, speaking not to God, but to himself. Translated, it read, "I have known the taste of power. I have seen nations bow. But I long for the days when I had nothing, just a staff, a stutter, and a flame." In a seminary in New York City, a professor named Dr. Naomi Goldstein, granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, lectured on Moses' humanity, not his miracles. She told her students, "The true miracle is not that Moses parted the sea, it's that he kept walking forward, even when he didn't believe in himself." She later published a book titled Moses, the Man Behind the Mantle, blending historical, biblical, and recently discovered confessional fragments. It stirred controversy. Some called it revisionist, but for many it became a lifeline, a reminder that greatness does not require perfection. And now his story remains. Not just in synagogues or churches or mosques, not just in temples, textbooks, or tombs, but in every soul who has ever doubted their calling, who has ever stood between failure and faith, who has ever heard God's voice and still asked, "Why me?" Because Moses still speaks. He speaks through broken leaders who rise again. He speaks through quiet servants who choose obedience over applause. He speaks through parents who carry burdens in silence, teachers who pour out their days with little thanks, warriors who weep in tents, and prophets who question their own worth. He speaks through those who've been raised in palaces and those born among bricks, those who carry two worlds in their soul and don't know where they belong. And what of the scroll? Some say it was lost in the flames of Rome. Others claim it was hidden in Ethiopia, passed from monk to monk until it was buried in the shadow of a sacred tree. But maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe Moses' true scroll isn't parchment at all. Maybe it's every scar he carried, every prayer he whispered in the dark, every time he stood before God and dared to be honest. And maybe that's why God chose him. Not because he was brave, but because he never pretended to be. The voice after the silence. The mountain stood quiet now. Nebo, once trembling under the footfall of a prophet, now rested in the solemn silence. No more whispers of wind carrying the breath of God, no more tablets, no more staff, no more miracles. Just rock and memory. Yet the earth remembered, beneath that final resting place, far from the eyes of men, unseen by kings, priests, or enemies, lay Moses. Not embalmed like a pharaoh, not enshrined in marble like Caesar, but embraced by the dust of the very land he was forbidden to enter. He died gazing toward promise, not into it, and this was his final act of obedience, to die fulfilled, yet unfinished. But God had not finished with him, for while men buried bones, God preserved legacy. In dreams, Moses appeared to prophets. In songs, he was named by psalmists. In scrolls, scribes traced his flame into history, and on another mountain many centuries later, as Galilean winds rushed through olive trees, Moses returned, not in flesh, but in glory. The Transfiguration, standing beside Elijah, silent beside the Christ. He said no words then. He had already spoken all he needed to. The secret within the secret. What then was Moses' great secret? Was it the palace where he was raised? The blood he never claimed? The murder he buried in sand? The laws he shattered in anger? No, his secret was this, that he never stopped loving the people who broke him. Not when they doubted him. Not when they betrayed him. Not when they turned to idols or begged for Egypt or wept for onions while heaven gave them manna. He loved them with a love that transcended reason. Not a weak love, but a fierce, costly, wilderness-forged love. A love that mirrored the very heart of the one who called him. The burden of knowing Moses carried knowledge others never wanted. He knew the cost of obedience. He knew the loneliness of leadership, the ache of standing before a raging people while your knees quake under heaven's silence. He knew that to see God's back was both gift and judgment. He knew what it was to want the promise so badly that he begged for it, only to be told, no, and he obeyed anyway. The final test. In his final days, God showed him the land of promise. Green hills, ripened figs, olive trees heavy with fruit, children laughing in valleys he would never step into. It was not a punishment. It was a mercy, because Moses' story was never about land. It was about the journey. It was never about arrival. It was about faithfulness in the in-between. He had spent his life moving between places, between peoples, between gods and men, between the thunder and the tent. And in that space, he learned the truest secret of all, that the holiest ground is not where miracles happen, but where you say yes to God even when your heart breaks. Legacy that walks. Moses never built a monument, but his legacy walked in the fire-lit faces of those who wandered the wilderness, in the scrolls gripped by trembling hands at temple gates, in the teachings of rabbis, the prayers of exiles, and the dreams of slaves. In every man or woman who stood before a burning bush of their own, unqualified, uncertain, yet chosen. Moses walked so they could. Some say the echo of Moses' final breath still floats over Mount Nebo, not as a wail, not as defeat, but as a sigh of peace. Because though he died in mystery, he lived in truth. And though he never entered the promised land, he entered something greater, the heart of God. If you seek Moses today, you will not find him in grave nor shrine, but you will find him in every whispered yes to a calling too heavy to carry. You will find him in every stuttered prayer, every cracked voice that still speaks truth, every broken leader who still walks forward. And when your strength fails and your desert feels endless, remember, even Moses was afraid. Even Moses failed. And still, God used him. This is the secret now exposed. This is the man now remembered. Not perfect, but faithful. When giants die, the ground still trembles. When a giant dies, the sky does not crack. There is no trumpet, no celestial chorus, no visible chariot of fire. But the ground remembers. The air changes. The wind knows that something eternal has passed through it. And so it was with Moses, the prince who became a shepherd, the fugitive who became a prophet, the flawed man who dared to hold the voice of God in his lungs. His death was not the end. It was a door. He was buried by God himself. No one saw the grave. No stone was carved. No mourning procession. No inheritance to divide. But something more permanent remained. A trail in the wilderness. A footprint in the sand. A fire that didn't burn out. The man who carried fire, Moses, was not remembered because he split seas. He was remembered because he split himself between royalty and servanthood, between anger and mercy, between justice and grace. He held the tension of heaven and earth until his back bowed under the weight of it. And when he could no longer stand, he knelt. Not to be weak, but to be real. He was the man who carried fire in his bones, not for fame, but for people who cursed him, betrayed him, wept for Egypt while he walked them to freedom. He never asked to be great. He never sought power. He asked for a voice. He asked for help. He asked to be unseen. He told God, send someone else. But God didn't, because sometimes the very ones who feel least capable are the ones he trusts most. Moses was not chosen because he was fearless. He was chosen because he obeyed while afraid. His greatest miracle wasn't the sea. It wasn't the plagues. It wasn't the staff turning to a serpent, or water flowing from rock, or manna raining from heaven. His greatest miracle was that he stayed. Stayed when the people grumbled. Stayed when they wanted to stone him. Stayed when he was misunderstood, alone, exhausted, exiled. He stayed faithful. That was the miracle. The final flame now across time, culture, and faith, the name Moses lives on. In Jewish scrolls, he is Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher. In Christian faith, he is the forerunner to the Messiah. In Islam, he is Musa, the prophet whose life mirrors patience and power. But beyond religion, Moses is this: a broken man who held unbreakable truth, a wounded soul who led a wounded people, a man who died with a dream still unfulfilled, yet a mission completed, for those who still wander. If you are wandering, if you are doubting, if you are leading people who don't see your worth, if you are carrying visions you may never see fulfilled, then Moses walks with you. Because sometimes the promised land is not a place. Sometimes it's a peace inside you, a whisper that says, you did your part. So what was the secret? You've waited, you've walked, you've followed the thread through palaces, plagues, deserts, and divine fires. So what was the great, buried, hidden truth behind Moses' life? Here it is. God doesn't use perfect people. He uses willing ones. The real secret wasn't about Moses. It was about what God can do with a man who says yes and keeps saying it even when it costs everything. And still he speaks. Moses is not done. His voice echoes not through tombs, but through lives changed, through leaders rising, through broken people who step forward anyway. He speaks when a mother hides her child from danger, when a leader defends justice in the face of exile, when a stammering soul finds the courage to speak. Moses lives in every burning bush that tells you you are more than your fear, in every mountain that whispers, you don't have to reach the end to be faithful. Moses' final word to you. If Moses were here now, standing dusty in his robes, staff in hand, eyes blazing with the fire of 1,000 conversations with God, he wouldn't tell you to be brave. He wouldn't tell you to be strong. He'd simply say, God is not finished with you, and neither is your story. Then he'd turn quietly and disappear into the wilderness. But this time, you'd follow the legacy buried in light. He was gone, no chariot, no sound, no stone to kneel beside, just silence, holy and whole. Yet somehow he remained, the invisible grave, the eternal voice. On the edge of Mount Nebo, beneath a breathless sky, Moses breathed his last. The earth bore no witness, no angel blew trumpet, no mourning crowd gathered, only God stood by, and it was enough. For when God buries a man, the world receives not his corpse, but his calling. What was left behind? No sandals, no staff, no tent, no written monument, but this he left behind. A law carved in stone, but etched deeper in the soul. A people once enslaved, now walking toward freedom. A history that could not be silenced. And a voice that still speaks when the fire falls. Moses in the mirror. You, yes, you reading this, are part of his story now. Not because you carry a staff, not because you wear robes or walk deserts, but because you wrestle with questions he once screamed into the stars. Who am I? What if they don't believe me? Why me, Lord? These were his. They are also yours. And still, God answers the same way. I will be with you. What if Moses had refused? What if he had stayed in the palace? What if he had clung to comfort, to luxury, to silence? History would have found another leader. But the world would have lost Moses, the man who stood in the gap, who broke in private what others built in public, who carried the word in cracked hands but delivered it faithfully, the man who wept behind the veil so others could dance outside it. When prophets become patterns, Moses in the echo of eternity. Long after the dust of the wilderness had settled, and the bones of kings turned to powder in their golden tombs, the story of a man named Moses still stirred the earth. He had no statues, He wrote no boastful songs of victory. He wore no crown. And yet, wherever the fire of faith flickered, whether in the deserts of Arabia, the catacombs of Rome, the hills of Ethiopia, or the churches of Jerusalem, his voice echoed like thunder through the soul of time. A life transcendent. In Egypt, he was once known as a prince. In Midian, he was a shepherd. In the desert, a liberator. But in the halls of heaven, Moses was something far greater. A friend of God, a man who dared to climb the mountain and ask, "Show me your glory." He had crossed every border of nations, of doubt, of sin, of death. He had stood in fire and did not burn. He had faced judgment and did not flee. He had spoken with the eternal and he had listened. His body was gone, hidden by God. But his life had become a living scripture written across the hearts of millions. Moses in the Messiah's shadow. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell. Prophets came and went. Scrolls were copied by trembling hands. And then one day, in the hills of Galilee, another teacher climbed a mountain. He too spoke with authority. He too gave law, not written on tablets of stone, but on the hearts of men. And on one radiant day, high on the Mount of Transfiguration, a few disciples saw what no man had seen since Mount Sinai. Moses standing in glory, speaking with the Son of God. He had entered the promised land after all, not by foot, but by faith. There, shining beside Elijah and Christ, Moses stood, no longer the fugitive, no longer the wanderer, but now a witness to the eternal kingdom he once glimpsed from afar. The story had come full circle. The voice that still speaks. Moses is not a myth. He is not a relic of religion. He is the echo of God's voice in human form. When the oppressed cry for justice, Moses speaks. When the enslaved dream of freedom, Moses walks beside them. When the lost seek purpose, his staff still parts the waters of doubt. His life says to every generation, "You are not your past. You are not your mistakes. You are not forgotten. God sees you. God calls you. God can use you. Because if God could use a broken boy in a basket, a prince with a stutter, a murderer in exile, then he can use you." The final words. His fire still burns. Moses died, yes, but his legacy did not. It burns like a bush that cannot be consumed. In every courtroom that defends justice, his law lives. In every pulpit that declares deliverance, his story breathes. In every soul that stands up to pharaohs of this world, his courage rises again. He was never meant to be the hero of his own story. God was, but Moses was the vessel. And that is enough. So if you listen in the quiet places of your heart, when the desert is dry and the mountain looms ahead, you may still hear it, the crackle of fire, the whisper of a call, the voice of God saying, "Take off your sandals. You are standing on holy ground." The final echo. Moses' secret past wasn't his weakness. It was his preparation. His shame became his strength. His exile became his altar. In the end, he didn't just lead people out of Egypt. He led them toward eternity. And he leads us still. The spirit of Moses lives on. Long after Moses' body vanished into the sacred soil beneath Mount Nebo. Long after the tents of Israel crossed into Canaan. Long after kings were crowned and kingdoms fell, Moses still walked among them, not in flesh, not in sandals and staff, but in spirit, in the trembling hands of scribes, the weeping of prophets, the prayers of slaves, and the songs of freedom. He became more than a man. He became a movement of God. The world without Moses. Yet full of Moses, Joshua led Israel forward. Cities fell, territories were claimed. The promise was fulfilled. But when the elders spoke around the fire, it wasn't Joshua's battles they remembered first. It was Moses, the voice that thundered from Sinai, the arms stretched over the Red Sea, the man who pleaded for mercy when the people deserved wrath, the leader who bore the weight of a nation until it broke him, only for God to remake him again. His absence left a silence, but that silence was filled with echoes. The whisper in every wilderness. Centuries passed, Israel grew proud, then fell again into exile and slavery. Once more they wept by rivers, chained in Babylon, hearts broken. And they remembered Moses. If God delivered us once, he can do it again. The God of Moses still watches. The fire still burns somewhere. The scrolls were unrolled. The story was read aloud in hushed synagogues. And even in darkness, hope flickered. The return of the voice. Then in a dry and dusty wilderness, a man clothed in camel hair stood shouting across the Jordan, "Prepare the way of the Lord." His name was John, the baptizer. But the fire in his voice? That was Moses' fire. It was the same holy flame, blazing now in a new generation. And when Jesus, the Christ, walked into the water, even the heavens remembered Moses. As Jesus fasted 40 days in the wilderness, Moses had done the same. As Jesus delivered a sermon on the mount, Moses had once delivered the law on a mountain. As Jesus fed the people with loaves, Moses had called manna from heaven. The parallels were not coincidence. They were fulfillment, the true promised land. Moses had led the people to the edge of a physical promise. Jesus would lead them into the eternal one. And when he rose from the grave, defeating death itself, he brought Moses' story to its true completion. The Exodus was never just about geography. It was about redemption, your wilderness, your fire. And now, in our time, in a world torn by confusion, injustice, weariness, the question echoes, where is the spirit of Moses today? The answer? It's in you. Every time you stand up to speak truth to power, every time you carry the weight of others' suffering, every time you pray not for revenge but for mercy, every time you feel unworthy but obey the call anyway, you walk where Moses walked, you cry out as he did, you trust as he did, you fall and rise as he did, because the God of Moses is still calling flawed people to lead, to love, and to liberate. The final benediction. From basket to glory, he began in a basket, forgotten. He died on a mountain, hidden. But he rose in our memory, in scripture, in faith. He is not gone. He is planted, like seed in the soil of eternity. And from that seed has grown a forest of freedom, prophecy, courage, and calling. Moses lives on, not because of who he was, but because of who called him. And that same voice is still calling today. Listen, the bush still burns, and it's calling your name. Moses' secret past exposed, the legacy complete. A baby hidden by a mother's trembling hands, a prince haunted by injustice, a fugitive turned prophet, a stutterer turned voice of a nation, a broken man used by an unbreakable God. Moses' secret was never just about his past. It was this: God chooses the least likely to do the most eternal. And that, dear listener, dear reader, dear wanderer, includes you. Moses was more than a man. He became a pattern, a shadow of the one to come. Like Jesus, he left royal status. Like Jesus, he was rejected by his own. Like Jesus, he ascended a mountain to meet with God. And like Jesus, he interceded for sinners, not with blood of animals, but with his own soul. "Blot me out," he once cried, "but save them." And God remembered. He always remembers men who are willing to lay down everything for others. Moses' true promised land. He didn't enter Canaan, but Moses entered something far greater. Not a land with milk and honey, but a realm with glory and fire. Not a temple made with stones, but a presence carved in eternity. The promised land wasn't denied. It was redefined. For the faithful, the real inheritance is not a plot of earth. It is the eternal favor of the God who walks beside them. The final echo, Moses is gone. But in every trembling voice that says, "Yes, Lord," in every burdened leader who refuses to quit, in every exile who becomes a deliverer, he rises again. This was the secret all along, that one man's obedience can unlock freedom for generations. Not because he was strong, but because he surrendered. Moses' voice now rests in you. So, what now? You've walked through palaces, deserts, seas, plagues, and fire. You've seen the secret unravel, layer by layer, truth by truth. Now the mantle passes, not as a staff, but as a story. Not as a duty, but as a destiny. The God of Moses still calls. still burns bushes, still parts seas. He's just waiting for someone, anyone, to say what Moses once stuttered. Here I am. The secret is no longer a secret. It's a call. It's a legacy. It's yours now. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and comment for more.